The cool February morning seemed like any other in Los Angeles, with the usual hustle and bustle of the entertainment industry moving in rhythmic waves. The air, crisp with the edge of early winter, carried with it a sense of anticipation as the late-night talk show began its live taping. The stage was brightly lit, reflecting the energy of the city that never truly slept. The audience, a mix of eager fans and industry professionals, filled the studio with an excited buzz, waiting to see one of the most famous actors in the world, Daniel Marlowe. His presence alone seemed to saturate the room with a sense of celebrity, his well-crafted image of charm and charisma making him a beloved figure to millions. On the other side of the city, Anisha Rosnah, a quiet and intelligent writer who had recently written a highly acclaimed article about the entertainment industry's superficial engagement with social justice, was preparing for her own moment. She wasn't a celebrity or a social media sensation. In fact, she hadn't even expected the invitation when it arrived in her inbox. But there she was, sitting in the VIP section, silently watching the talk show unfold as the crowd reveled in the lighthearted banter between the host and the star of the night. Anisha didn't know much about Daniel Marlowe, aside from his reputation as a talented actor and his frequent appearances in the tabloids. He was known for his rugged looks and the effortless way he navigated interviews, always armed with witty comebacks and a calculated ease. The tabloids loved him. His fans adored him, and everyone who interacted with him seemed to worship the ground he walked on. His career, built on roles in action-packed blockbusters, had cemented his status as one of Hollywood's elite. But for Anisha, the more she read about him, the more she saw the cracks behind the polished persona. His words often seemed shallow. His activism performed like a part of his brand, rather than a genuine reflection of his values. To her, he was an example of the growing culture in Hollywood, a world where speaking out about social issues often felt more like a marketing strategy than a real call to action. She had spent the last few months writing about the very things she despised: celebrities who used their public platform for self-promotion under the guise of making change. It wasn't a piece designed to tear people down, but to force a reflection on what it meant to have influence without responsibility. As she sat in the studio, a sense of discomfort settled over her. She wasn't nervous about being on the show itself, but about how her words would be received. She had a sharpness to her that not everyone appreciated. She had always been the type to confront things head-on, especially when it came to issues she felt were being glossed over by people with more power than they cared to acknowledge. The host, Jeff Simmons, was a seasoned professional, known for his charisma and his ability to get even the most guarded celebrities to open up. Tonight, the audience was eager to hear about Daniel's latest project, a new action film that was expected to dominate the box office. Jeff played up the excitement, keeping things lighthearted, letting the actor's natural charm take center stage. The atmosphere was one of easy camaraderie as the conversation flowed between the two. But then, the tone shifted. Jeff, knowing his guest well, decided to steer the conversation in a direction that was a little less predictable. He turned to Anisha, who had been quietly sitting beside them, and asked her about her latest piece. It was a moment that should have been brief, perhaps a mention of her work and a casual nod to her insights. But Jeff made a subtle misstep. He was trying to include her in the dialogue, but in doing so, he made her feel as though she were an accessory to the show, someone to be used for the sake of a more interesting dynamic. The entire situation felt disjointed. Anisha had never been one for attention, much less for forced commentary. She wasn't used to being thrust into the limelight in such a way. Anisha, Jeff said, turning to her with an easy grin. You've been pretty vocal about how the entertainment industry uses social justice movements for their own benefit. Care to share your thoughts with us? The question lingered in the air, almost like an unspoken challenge. Daniel Marlowe, who had been listening quietly, gave a brief glance toward her. He seemed amused, but there was a hint of something else in his eyes. Perhaps it was irritation. Or maybe it was simply that he wasn't accustomed to being challenged in such a way. He was a man who had always known how to manipulate his image to fit whatever narrative he wanted the world to believe. And now, sitting across from Anisha, it felt like his carefully constructed persona was under attack. Anisha, for a brief moment, hesitated. The eyes of the studio were now on her, and her usual calm demeanor began to falter. But this was her chance to say something important, something real. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "The issue," she began, her voice steady, but firm, "is that Hollywood doesn't engage with these issues in any meaningful way. They'll post a hashtag, show up at a rally, maybe give an interview to promote a cause, but it's rarely followed by real action. It's performative activism. They want to be seen as progressive without actually making the hard changes necessary." The media audience, who had been expectantly quiet, now murmured in response. Some nodded, others looked uncertain. But Daniel Marlowe, sitting across from her, did not look pleased. His smile, which had been so effortlessly charming just moments before, faded into something colder. The comments, aimed directly at the very people who had made him rich and famous, stung in a way he didn't expect. Anisha's words hit a nerve. The space between them seemed to grow. Daniel's bravado, which had carried him through countless interviews and public appearances, faltered. He could feel his grip on the conversation slipping. He wasn't used to being criticized, especially not on live television, and certainly not by someone who wasn't even a part of the glittering world he inhabited. He had dealt with journalists, fans, and critics before, but this felt different. There was a bite to her words, something he couldn't simply shrug off. He leaned forward slightly, a small smirk playing at the edges of his lips. "Well, Anisha, I guess you'd know all about doing nothing, wouldn't you?" he said, his voice laced with condescension. "What do you even do besides write your little blog posts that no one reads?" The moment froze. It wasn't a loud remark, but it was piercing in its sharpness. The audience grew suddenly silent, and Anisha could feel the weight of the insult bearing down on her. She was taken aback, unsure if she had heard him correctly at first. But as the reality of his words set in, she felt a surge of anger rise. Within her, not for herself, but for the blatant disrespect he had just displayed. The cameras were still rolling, the spotlight still trained on her, and in that instant, she realized that this wasn't just about a public insult. It was a reminder of the systemic hierarchies in place, where celebrities like Daniel were untouchable, where people like her, trying to call attention to real issues, were relegated to the sidelines. Anisha took a breath, refusing to let the emotion overwhelm her. But she couldn't simply ignore the insult. This was not just about her pride. It was about how society, and particularly the entertainment industry, treated people like her, people who weren't in the limelight, people who didn't have the same privileges. She had been subjected to microaggressions before, but this was different. This was a direct attack on her worth. Daniel, for his part, leaned back in his chair, as if the confrontation had been resolved in his favor. He had delivered a cutting blow, one that many might have found humorous or at least defensible as banter. But as he looked around at the awkward tension in the room, the energy had shifted. The jokes, the lightheartedness. It all seemed to evaporate. Jeff, sensing the change, quickly tried to fill the silence with another question, but it was too late. The damage was done. Anisha could feel the eyes of the room on her, watching, waiting for her to respond. She knew that if she spoke, if she responded in kind, it would only escalate the situation. But if she stayed silent, it would feel like acceptance. She had always prided herself on standing up for what she believed in, no matter the personal cost. And so, she met Daniel's gaze, her eyes unflinching, but she didn't respond immediately. Instead, she sat back in her chair, letting the silence stretch. She knew that the real response wouldn't come in a snap retort. It would come later in the form of actions, of words that had weight beyond the moment. She wasn't going to let this go. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was a beginning. The cameras continued to roll, the audience held their breath, and Daniel Marlowe sat there, unaware that the consequences of his words would soon spiral far beyond what he had anticipated. The seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity. Anisha's gaze didn't waver from Daniel's, even as the room around them buzzed with an uncomfortable tension. The cameras kept rolling, their bright lights casting an almost surreal glow on the scene, As though the entire world had paused to witness the small, public battle that was playing out before them, Daniel Marlowe, who had become accustomed to being the center of attention, now found himself on unfamiliar ground. He had been so sure of his control in this space, so certain that his sharp wit and undeniable charm could navigate him through any situation. But this was different. The words he had chosen, delivered with a sense of arrogance and superiority, hung in the air. It had been a careless remark, one that might have been dismissed by some as nothing more than a poorly aimed jab, but as soon as they left his lips, Daniel knew he had made a mistake. He had miscalculated the woman sitting before him. Anisha Rosnah wasn't like the others. She wasn't an eager fan, desperate for approval, or a fellow actor with a fabricated story to tell. She was someone who had built her own reputation, forged her own path, and now here she was calling out the very system he represented, and he had just insulted her. Daniel quickly scanned the room, looking for signs of approval, hoping that his words might have landed in a way that would make the crowd laugh or at least nod in agreement. But instead, he saw faces stiffen, eyes narrowing, and lips pressing into thin lines. Even Jeff, the seasoned host, seemed to falter for a moment, his smile slipping as he tried to steer the conversation back on course. But the damage was done. The unspoken tension had already set in, thick and palpable. Anisha remained silent, though the anger that had surged within her now simmered beneath the surface. Her fingers, tightly clasped in her lap, twitched with a nervous energy that betrayed her calm exterior. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. She had never been one to shy away from conflict, but this was different. This wasn't just an online troll or a careless comment from an anonymous stranger. This was Daniel Marlowe, a man with a reputation, a household name, speaking to her as though she were nothing more than an annoyance, a lesser voice that could be easily dismissed. She had been dismissed before, of course, but this time, it stung. The crowd waited for her response, anticipating a retort, a clever comeback, or perhaps even a biting insult of her own. Anisha, however, had learned long ago that retaliation in these situations only perpetuated the cycle. She would not stoop to his level. Instead, she would let her silence speak volumes. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He could feel the eyes of the room on him, watching, scrutinizing, waiting to see how he would handle the situation. He'd become accustomed to being adored, to hearing his every word greeted with applause or laughter. But here, in this moment, he was no longer the charming star. He was the man who had insulted someone who didn't belong to his world, the world of glitz, glamour, and unchecked power. It unsettled him more than he was willing to admit. He glanced at Jeff, who had been fumbling with his cue cards in an attempt to find a way out of the awkward silence. The host had always been able to steer conversations with ease, but even he couldn't pull them out of this one. Instead, Jeff gave a slight, uncertain smile and quickly changed the subject, asking about Daniel's upcoming movie. But it was too late to simply move past the moment. Anisha's mind was racing. She knew that her words earlier had been direct, but they hadn't been hostile. She had never intended to attack Daniel personally. But now, as the reality of his response settled in, she realized that the conversation had shifted. What had begun as a conversation about activism and Hollywood's hollow gestures had turned into something more personal, a confrontation between two people who didn't belong to the same world, who didn't share the same values or experiences. Daniel, with his golden boy image and his carefully crafted persona, had revealed something darker beneath the surface, an arrogance, a sense of entitlement that made him believe he could speak down to her without consequence. For the rest of the interview, Anisha held her composure, but inside she was seething. She had been in this industry long enough to know how these things worked. Celebrities like Daniel Marlowe didn't often face consequences for their actions. Their power, their influence, insulated them from the realities that most people had to navigate. She had been dismissed, belittled, and ignored by people like him for years, but somehow this felt different. As the show came to a close, Jeff wrapped up the interview with a few more pleasantries, thanking Daniel for coming on the show and promoting his new film. The audience clapped, the lights dimmed, and the cameras stopped rolling. But the tension in the room didn't immediately dissipate. The cast and crew began to file out, and Anisha stood up, her body stiff with the weight of what had just transpired. Daniel, meanwhile, was already turning to leave, his entourage of assistants and managers buzzing around him like a swarm of bees. He was about to walk off the stage when he heard someone clear their throat behind him. It was Anisha. She didn't want to confront him here in front of everyone, but she couldn't let it go. She couldn't just walk away and pretend like nothing had happened. So, as Daniel passed by her, she spoke up, her voice steady but firm. "I'd appreciate it if you didn't speak to me like that again." Daniel stopped in his tracks. He hadn't expected her to say anything. He had thought that by now, she would have moved on, just like everyone else who had ever been on the receiving end of one of his remarks. But here she was, standing in front of him, not backing down. He turned to face her, his expression a mixture of confusion and annoyance. "What's your problem?" he asked, his voice a little sharper than he intended. "You really going to hold a grudge over a little joke?" Anisha's eyes narrowed. She could feel the anger rising again, but she refused to let it overtake her. She wouldn't let him minimize this, wouldn't let him dismiss it as a little joke. "It wasn't a joke," she replied, her voice cold. "You were disrespectful, and you know it." For a moment, Daniel was taken aback. He wasn't used to people speaking to him like that. Most people were afraid to confront him, or if they did, it was with some half-hearted attempt at civility. But Anisha wasn't backing down. She wasn't afraid of him, and that, in and of itself, made him uneasy. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words caught in his throat. There was something about the way she was looking at him, something that made him pause. It wasn't just her calm demeanor or her refusal to be intimidated. It was the way she stood there, unwavering, as if she was calling out a truth that he didn't want to hear. He felt a small, unfamiliar twinge of guilt, but it was fleeting. The actor in him wanted to brush it off, to laugh it away and move. On to the next thing, the next project, the next adoring fan. But a part of him, something buried deep inside, recognized that he had crossed a line. "I didn't mean it like that," he finally muttered, though the words lacked conviction. He wasn't even sure if he believed them himself. Anisha took a step back, her expression unreadable. "That's the problem," she said softly. "You don't mean it. And that's why people like me speak up. Because people like you think you can say anything and there will be no consequences. But there are consequences, Daniel. And you're going to have to face them eventually." With that, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. Daniel stood there for a moment, watching her go, his mind spinning. He had no idea what she had meant by that last comment, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. It wasn't just about one insult, one remark. It was about something deeper, something he wasn't quite ready to confront. But as the day wore on and the images of her words lingered in his mind, he began to realize that perhaps, just perhaps, he had underestimated her, and that, in itself, was a mistake he might regret. Daniel Marlowe woke up the next morning feeling a sense of discomfort that he couldn't quite shake off. It wasn't the usual discomfort he felt after a night of indulgence. Those mornings were filled with the nagging hangovers of too many drinks or too little sleep. This was different. The sense of unease gnawed at him as he lay in his plush bed, the sunlight creeping through the heavy curtains of his penthouse. The previous evening's encounter with Anisha Rosnah kept playing over and over in his mind, like a broken record that he couldn't silence. He wasn't used to feeling this way. After all, he was Daniel Marlowe, a star whose fame had been built on his ability to charm and deflect. He was a man who knew how to control every situation, to make the world bend to his will. He had faced countless journalists, critics, and fans, most of whom adored him, some who disliked him, but none who made him question his actions the way Anisha had. He tried to dismiss it at first, brushing off the sting of her words as nothing more than a minor annoyance. But as the morning wore on, the unease grew into something more substantial. He couldn't help but replay her final words in his head, that cold, calculated response that had left him with a sense of emptiness. You're going to have to face them eventually. It was a simple statement, but it carried an undeniable weight. The words echoed in his mind, and with each repetition, the discomfort grew. He found himself unable to move past it, as though Anisha's challenge had struck a nerve that he wasn't prepared to address. He had thought it would be easy to dismiss her, to ignore her existence after the show. After all, she was just a writer, a journalist, someone who wasn't even part of his world. But there was something about her, a quiet strength, an unwavering conviction, that had unsettled him. He had expected her to be an easy target for his usual banter, but instead, she had stood her ground, and he had been the one who came out looking foolish. In the days that followed, Daniel tried to carry on with his life as usual, immersing himself in his film promotion and his numerous social media obligations. He had interviews, photo shoots, and brand deals to attend to. But no matter how hard he tried, the incident with Anisha lingered in the back of his mind, refusing to be pushed. Aside, he had made a mistake. That much was clear now. He hadn't meant to insult her, not in the way that it had come across. It had been a slip of the tongue, a poorly timed remark in a conversation that had spiraled out of control. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that it wasn't just the words that bothered him, it was the intent behind them. He had been so quick to dismiss her, to belittle her in front of an audience, all because she had challenged the very system that had made him who he was. And in doing so, he had revealed something about himself that he didn't like. The fact was, Daniel had never been confronted like that before. People didn't question him, at least not openly, and certainly not in front of millions of viewers. The entertainment industry was full of people who wanted something from him. Fans who adored him, producers who sought his star power, agents who coveted his career. He was the one who held the power, the one who controlled the narrative. So, when someone like Anisha, someone outside of his bubble, called him out, it had felt like an affront. But now, as the days wore on, he realized that the real problem was not with her. It was with him. He had never really stopped to think about the implications of his actions. Hollywood, the industry he had built his empire in, was one of convenience. It was a world where image meant everything, where people said the right things to get ahead, but rarely followed through. He had always gone along with it, using his platform to endorse causes that seemed to align with his public image. But he had never truly examined what those causes meant, or whether his endorsement was genuine. And now, after hearing Anisha's words, he found himself questioning everything. Was he just another actor, another face in the crowd of celebrities who used their fame to sell a brand of justice that didn't exist? In the days after the show, Daniel found himself watching the clips of the interview over and over again. The internet had exploded with commentary, some fans defending him, others criticizing him, and many more focusing on Anisha's remarks. There were memes, hashtags, and viral posts. But what caught his attention the most were the interviews and commentaries from writers and activists who had taken note of his dismissive attitude toward Anisha. They had seen what he had done, and now it seemed like everyone had an opinion. The criticism wasn't just about one comment, it was about his entire career, his public persona, and the way he had perpetuated the very system that Anisha had spoken out against. For the first time in his life, Daniel felt exposed. The facade of perfection that he had so carefully built around himself seemed to be cracking. It wasn't just about the comments from Anisha, it was the realization that everything he had been doing had been a performance. He had played the role of the woke celebrity, the one who tweeted about injustice and showed up at rallies, but now he saw it for what it really was, a shallow attempt to maintain his image. As the week wore on, the pressure of the situation started to weigh on him. His team, always eager to protect his image, advised him to let the incident die down, to avoid commenting on it publicly, and to focus on his upcoming projects. But Daniel couldn't just let it go. There was a part of him, something deep inside, that knew he had to do something, anything, to make amends. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that he owed Anisha an apology. Not because he feared the backlash or the loss of fans, but because he knew he had wronged her in a way that he couldn't ignore. One night, after a long day of meetings and rehearsals, Daniel sat down at his desk, staring at the blank screen of his laptop. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he struggled to find the right words. He wasn't good at apologies. He had never really needed to apologize before. But this felt different. This wasn't a matter of public relations or saving face. This was about confronting his own shortcomings, about acknowledging the harm he had caused. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he began to type. He started with a simple line, a direct acknowledgement of his actions. He didn't make excuses. He didn't try to shift the blame. He just admitted that he had been wrong. He admitted that his words had been hurtful and dismissive, and that he had underestimated Anisha. He expressed his regret for how he had treated her, and for how his actions had reflected a lack of genuine understanding about the very issues she had raised. When he finished the message, Daniel sat back in his chair, staring at the screen for a moment longer. He wasn't sure if this would be enough, if an apology could repair the damage he had caused. But it was a start, and for the first time in days, he felt a small weight lift from his shoulders. The next morning, as the apology was posted on his social media accounts, Daniel braced himself for the reaction. He wasn't sure what to expect. Would people believe him? Would they see it as a genuine effort or just another PR stunt? The response came quickly. Some fans praised him for taking responsibility, for being vulnerable and admitting his mistake. Others were more skeptical, accusing him of only apologizing because of the backlash. But amidst the mixed reactions, Daniel couldn't ignore the sense of relief that washed over him. For the first time, he felt like he was doing something real, something that went beyond the superficial world of Hollywood, but he knew that this was just the beginning. Anisha's words had cut deeper than he could have imagined, and as he moved forward, he realized that he would have to change the way he engaged with the world around him. The apology, while necessary, was only a first step. To truly make a difference, he would have to do more than just apologize. He would have to prove that he had learned from his mistake, that he was willing to put in the work to change, not just for the sake of his image, but because it was the right thing to do. Daniel Marlowe had always prided himself on being in control, but for the first time in his life, he realized that he had no control over the lasting effects of his actions. He could only move forward, slowly, but with the hope that redemption was possible, even for someone like him. Weeks passed, and the media frenzy surrounding the incident slowly began to die down. The social media posts, the articles, the endless debate, it all faded into the background as life continued, as it always did in the entertainment industry. But for Daniel Marlowe, the consequences of that fateful interview lingered far longer than he had anticipated. The apology he had posted online had been a first step, a symbolic gesture that had been met with mixed reactions, but it hadn't been enough. Daniel had spent the days following the incident trying to move on, attempting to push past the guilt that had gnawed at him since that moment. He had kept up appearances, attending premieres, posing for the cameras, and continuing his promotional work. On the surface, everything seemed normal. The actor was still the star, still the charming, lovable face that the world adored. But beneath that facade, something had shifted inside of him. The events of that interview had left a mark that he couldn't ignore, and no amount of work, no amount of applause, could erase the fact that he had hurt someone. Worse still, he had hurt someone who, in his arrogance, he hadn't even considered worthy of his respect. The day of the charity gala arrived, and Daniel found himself standing in front of a mirror, adjusting his tuxedo. It was supposed to be another routine evening, a glamorous event filled with the usual suspects, fellow actors, producers, directors, and influencers. But this time, the event felt different. It wasn't just about the glitz and the glamour. This time, it was about something more personal. The gala was being held to raise funds for a cause that Anisha had long been involved with, an initiative aimed at providing resources for underrepresented communities in the entertainment industry. It was exactly the type of event Daniel would have once attended to collect praise for his support of progressive causes, to take a few photos, maybe deliver a speech or two. But this time, his feelings were mixed. He wasn't sure he deserved to be there, not after what had happened. The idea of seeing Anisha again filled him with anxiety. He had been avoiding her for weeks. Every time he saw her name in the headlines, his stomach turned. He hadn't spoken to her since her eventually. This gala felt like the right moment, a public place where both of them could address what had transpired without the harsh glare of cameras or the pressure of an interview. When Daniel arrived at the venue, he could feel the weight of his actions pressing down on him. The grand ballroom was filled with the hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, and the occasional laughter that echoed through the high-ceilinged room. The attendees were dressed to the nines, but Daniel's mind wasn't on the lavish surroundings or the people who greeted him with fake smiles. He was searching for one person, and one person only, Anisha. He spotted her across the room, standing by a group of prominent writers and activists, all of whom seemed engaged in a lively conversation. She was dressed in a sleek black gown that hugged her frame in a way that was understated yet elegant. Her posture was confident, her expression unreadable, and Daniel couldn't help but notice how she seemed to command the room without even trying. He felt a pang of guilt rise in his chest as he took in the sight of her. She didn't belong in this world. She didn't need the validation of Hollywood or the adoration of fans. She had earned everything she had, built her own platform, and made a real difference. Daniel took a deep breath and slowly made his way through the crowd, each step feeling heavier than the last. He couldn't avoid her any longer. He knew this moment had to come, and he had to be the one to take the first step. He had already apologized online, but that had been easy, an impersonal statement that he had sent out to thousands of strangers. This, however, would be different. This would require something far more difficult: sincerity. When he finally reached her side, Anisha glanced up at him. For a moment, there was silence. Her gaze was calm, but her eyes held something deeper, something that made Daniel pause. It was the same look she had given him during the interview, the one that had made him feel like he wasn't in control. It was a look that seemed to say, "I see you. I know exactly who you are." He stood there, unsure of how to proceed, but Anisha didn't wait for him to speak. She turned slightly, her body language open but guarded. She had been waiting for this moment as well, though she had no idea how it would unfold. She didn't want to dwell on the past. She didn't want to drag the situation out, but she also wasn't going to let it slide. She had seen the apology online, but that had been a formality, an attempt to save face. This face-to-face interaction was where the real reckoning would occur. Daniel cleared his throat, his voice softer than usual. "Anisha," he started, the words feeling heavier than he had imagined. "I've been meaning to talk to you about what happened." Anisha gave him a nod, her expression unreadable. "I'm listening," she said, her tone neutral but firm. For a long moment, Daniel was silent, as if he were searching for the right words that would adequately convey the regret he had been carrying for weeks. "I've been thinking about everything," he said, finally meeting her gaze. "About that interview, about what I said. And I want to say that I'm sorry. I was wrong. The way I spoke to you, the way I dismissed you, it was disrespectful. And it wasn't just wrong, it was careless." Anisha's eyes softened, but there was still an edge to her expression. She could tell that Daniel was being genuine, but there was something else in his voice that she couldn't quite place. "It wasn't just careless," she replied, her tone quiet but steady. "You were minimizing my experience. You were minimizing what I stand for. And that hurts." Daniel winced at her words. He had been expecting her to brush it off, to accept the apology and move on. But instead, she had called him out again, and it cut deeper than he expected. He wasn't sure how to respond, but he knew he had to keep going. "I understand that now," he said, his voice quiet. "I think I've been so wrapped up in my own world, in my own career, that I didn't even stop to think about how my actions might affect others. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know that I'm committed to learning, to being better. I've been wrong for a long time, and I want to change." There was a pause as Anisha took in his words. She had expected him to say something like this, but hearing it out loud made it feel real in a way that nothing else had. She had always been skeptical of apologies from people like him, people who wielded power and influence without ever truly understanding the impact of their actions. But this was different. For the first time, she saw something in Daniel Marlowe that she hadn't seen before. It wasn't just an apology, it was the beginning of accountability. She nodded slowly, her gaze softening. "I appreciate that," she said quietly. "But words are only part of it. It's about action. You're not going to change the world overnight, but you can start by acknowledging your privilege and using it to lift others up. You can start by being the kind of ally you've pretended to be." Daniel swallowed hard. It wasn't easy to hear, but it was the truth. He had been a part of the problem, and if he wanted to be part of the solution, he needed to do more than just apologize. He needed to change the way he saw the world, the way he engaged with it, and the way he used his platform. "I will," he said, his voice firm. "I promise." Anisha nodded again, her eyes searching his for sincerity. For a moment, the tension in the air seemed to dissipate, replaced by something unspoken, a quiet understanding between the two of them. They were not equals in the traditional sense. He was the star, the celebrity, the one with all the power. She was the activist, the voice for those who had been ignored for far too long. But in that moment, there was a sense of mutual respect, an acknowledgement of the journey that each of them had to walk in their own way. With that, Anisha turned and rejoined the group she had been speaking with, leaving Daniel standing there, his mind reeling with the weight of the conversation. He had no idea where this path would lead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt as though he was finally on the right one. The road ahead would be long, and the consequences of his past actions would never fully disappear, but he knew that this was the beginning of something different, something that might just change him for good.